What's going on, people of History of the Americas? Today we're going to be talking about the establishment of the United States government and politics, largely starting right after independence with the development of the Articles of Confederation. And we're going to eventually get us to talking about a little bit about the U.S. Constitution, its structure, and its various elements. Today, we're going to start by kind of reviewing the essential question. I'll remind you that the focus for us for this unit should be talking about how the establishment of the United States government both symbolizes a continuity and a change in political thought throughout the region. Some focus questions I want you guys to think about in terms of the kind of IB key concepts is change, continuity, causation, consequence, significance, and perspective. Making sure that as we're going throughout this unit, you guys are referring back to these kind of command terms. So, beginning with the Articles of Confederation, we're really talking about the weaknesses of the America's first government. We've kind of spent some time in class developing our understanding of what exactly the Articles of Confederation was and what its necessary pitfalls were, and why we actually needed another form of government and why the founders felt that we needed another form of government. So just to kind of recap, what you guys should kind of already know is that 1, each state had 1 vote in Congress, regardless of size. 2, Congress had no power to tax. 3, there was no executive branch. 4, there was no national court system. 5, amendments required a unanimous vote. And 6, states printed their own currency. All of these things really created kind of a murky situation between both federal and state power and how they kind of coexisted. You can obviously kind of think with 13 colonies, that's an odd number. It might work out in terms of voting, but this didn't really kind of respect some of the colonies in terms of population, that some colonies had more population than other colonies. So this didn't really reflect the will of the people in terms of the amount of the people for each state. It was just each state gets their own set vote, and that was their total power of opinions in the Congress. In addition to that, the power to be able to tax made it difficult for the government to be able to raise money for paying for things such as schools, roads, wars, things like that. So it really put the country in a interesting situation of being able to need to do things but not being able to pay for them. Didn't have an executive branch like we see it, did not have a court system. So it largely looked a lot different than what we have today, which largely brought forth the context for our constitutional convention that we're going to be eventually, the mock constitutional convention, I should say, that we're going to be holding at the end of this unit, that is aimed at addressing some of these problems and trying to come up with a solution to fix it. And this all begins with the Philadelphia Convention. They met in 1787 to basically decide to create a new government rather than fix the Articles of Confederation. And I'll remind you that we are quite some time after the end of this official end of independence, and now this kind of nation building kind of phase for the United States. So some key figures of this convention, you got your main players kind of like George Washington and Ben Franklin. You also have James Madison, which many of you guys, you Federalists, are familiar with. You also have Alexander Hamilton, who many of you guys should be familiar with at this point in time. And we're going to be kind of doing a fun activity coming up talking about Alexander Hamilton in addition to the play itself. George Mason is also another person we should keep our eyes on throughout this time period, and also Roger Sherman as well. Try to keep some figures, I guess, in perspective of the Constitutional Convention. So what were some plans for the Constitution? You had largely 2 competing plans, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan argued for a separation of powers, a bicameral legislature based on population, so what we kind of see in terms of like the Senate and House of Representatives, and basing that off of population in terms of how many delegates get to be in that kind of, or representatives get to be in that legislature and also a federal government that had increased powers. On the flip side, the New Jersey plan came about in terms of a unicameral legislature where every state received equal representation and there was no House of Representatives or no Senate. It was just one body of Congress. So the ratification debate over the Constitution itself, kind of fast forwarding here a little bit, is that there was 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify or approve the Constitution before it went into effect. So really what this sparked was this kind of battle between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists as to who would be able to decide what goes into the new Constitution and how that should look. So the ratification debate kind of follows along this this time period and ultimately getting us to where we see the ratification conventions and where people fell in their own respective states. So let's talk about the Constitution itself. We're kind of glossing over a lot of those debates. Again, we're going to get to that when we get to our mock constitutional convention. But to start, what is the U.S. Constitution? It's generally regarded as the supreme law of the United States. It is what gives power to our government. Without the Constitution, there would be no government. So it's the foundation and source of legal authority that basically creates the existence of the United States of America and the federal government of the United States. It also provides the framework for how the government should operate the day-to-day affairs of the country. And what are the basic principles of the United States Constitution? They rely on popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, and this idea of federalism. All some things that we've kind of discussed in class, but really popular sovereignty is talking about the government power residing with the people. Limited government, meaning that government is only allowed to do the things it's being told it can do from the Constitution, that there's a separation of powers, that not one branch is having too much power, and also this idea of federalism, that there's this division of power between the nation and state governments. So let's talk more about these checks and balances. What exactly are they? They're pretty difficult to understand, but also kind of easy at the same time. Each one of these 3 branches of government, the executive, judicial, and legislative branch that are created by the United States Constitution, all were given separate powers to both operate their aspect of government and society, but also to make sure that the other branch of government is maintaining their responsibilities and not overreaching. So just take a second to kind of understand what exactly the layout of this kind of chart is, this flow chart is talking about. But basically, the executive branch, where you have largely a lot of the presidential power and executive power to operate the affairs of the country. Basically, the president can appoint judges to fill vacancies. They can also grant and receive reprieves. And so when we're talking about the executive branch, we're talking about them being able to have the powers over the judicial branch in terms of being able to appoint judges. When we're talking about their powers in terms of over the legislative branch in terms of a check and balance, is basically they're the commander in chief. They can veto the bills that the Congress sends to the executive to approve. On the flip side, the legislative branch can override presidential vetoes. They can control appropriations. They have the power to declare war, not the president. And on the flip side, with the judicial branch, they can rule that the president's actions are unconstitutional. And they are also, once they are appointed to that position for life.